On November the 17th, 1998, at 2:47 in the afternoon, a server in a Moscow data center stopped responding. The technician who discovered it ran a diagnostic and found that the machine had been offline for approximately 11 minutes. By the time the server was restarted, 47 wire transfers had failed to complete. Each transfer was attempting to move approximately $8,000 from one Russian bank to another. The sending banks had already debited the accounts. The receiving banks had no record of incoming funds. In total, $376,000 existed nowhere. It took 16 days to locate the money. During those 16 days, none of the individuals whose accounts had been debited knew anything was wrong. The funds reappeared in stages, in amounts that bore no relationship to the original transfers, distributed across accounts that had not been part of the initial transactions. No explanation was provided. When regulators asked for transaction logs, they were told the logs had been corrupted in the outage. The case was closed without a determination of whether the money had been stolen, temporarily misrouted, or had never actually moved at all. What makes this incident notable is not what happened during those 16 days, but what happened in the months that followed. Each of the affected individuals had, at the time of the incident, an average bank balance equivalent to approximately 2 years of local median income. Within 9 months of the outage, 14 of them had depleted their accounts entirely. The remaining individuals maintained their balances, but in interviews conducted years later, each described a change in their relationship to the money. They began checking their balances multiple times per day. They began withdrawing cash for purchases they would have previously made with cards. They began, in other words, behaving as though the money in their accounts was less real than the currency they could hold. This behavioral shift was not limited to those who had been directly affected. Word of the outage spread through social networks. People who had not lost money, who had not even banked at the affected institutions, began exhibiting the same patterns. The contagion was not fear of loss. It was uncertainty about what money was when it existed only as information. The standard explanation for this behavior is psychological. People became anxious about digital systems and reverted to physical currency as a coping mechanism. This explanation treats the behavior as irrational, a failure to understand that money has always been a form of information, whether recorded on paper ledgers or electronic databases. But this explanation ignores what the affected individuals were actually doing. They were not reverting to an older system because they misunderstood the new one. They were discovering that the new system had properties the old one did not, and those properties made certain questions unanswerable. When money exists as physical currency, the question of whether it exists has a simple answer. You can see it, hold it, verify its presence through direct observation. When money exists as information in a database, the question of whether it exists depends on the reliability of the database, the integrity of the system maintaining it, and the trustworthiness of the institutions asserting its presence. During those 16 days in 1998, the question of whether the money existed had no answer. The sending banks said it had left. The receiving banks said it had not arrived. The individuals said their accounts showed one thing yesterday and something different today. Each party had information. None of the information agreed. In that gap between contradictory information systems, money did not exist in any meaningful sense. This is the condition that digital currency advocates describe as a problem to be solved. They argue that blockchain technology eliminates the need for trust by creating a distributed ledger that no single party can alter. Every transaction is recorded in multiple locations. Every participant can verify the ledger's integrity. The system replaces institutional trust with mathematical certainty. This argument is compelling until you examine what happens when the system encounters a situation it was not designed to handle. On August 1st, 2010, a Bitcoin user discovered that block 74638 contained a transaction that created 184 billion Bitcoins, despite the protocol's limit of 21 million. The transaction exploited an integer overflow vulnerability in the code that validated transaction outputs. For approximately 5 hours, the Bitcoin ledger contained information that was mathematically impossible according to the protocol's rules. The response was to create a new version of the software that ignored the problematic block and all subsequent blocks built on it, effectively rewriting the chain's history. The official explanation was that the community had reached consensus to restore the integrity of the system. In practice, a small number of core developers made a decision, convinced a majority of miners to adopt it, and the ledger changed. The mathematical certainty that was supposed to eliminate the need for trust had been overridden by a human decision about which version of history to accept. The Bitcoin community describes this incident as proof that the system works. A vulnerability was discovered, addressed, and resolved through decentralized consensus. But the incident demonstrates something more fundamental about what happens when money exists purely as information. The question of which ledger to trust became a question of which group of developers to trust, which miners to follow, which version of history to accept as legitimate. The mathematical certainty of the blockchain did not eliminate trust. It redistributed it to a different set of actors, making decisions about which rules to enforce and which transactions to recognize. The individuals holding Bitcoin during those 5 hours had no way to determine whether their balances were correct. They had information from the ledger, information from developers, information from mining pools, and all of it contradicted itself until someone decided which information to treat as authoritative. The decision was made quickly, and the system stabilized, but the mechanism that produced stability was not mathematical consensus. It was a small group of people convincing a larger group to accept their judgment about what should count as true. This is the pattern that repeats whenever digital currency systems encounter conditions they were not designed to handle. In June 2016, a venture capital fund built on the Ethereum blockchain discovered that an attacker had exploited a vulnerability in its code to drain approximately $50 million worth of Ethereum. The code was executing exactly as written. There was no hack in the traditional sense, no security breach, no unauthorized access. The attacker had simply found a way to use the code's own logic against it. The Ethereum community faced a choice. They could allow the theft to stand, treating the code as law and accepting that the system had produced an outcome they considered illegitimate, or they could alter the blockchain to return the stolen funds, violating the principle that code is immutable and that past transactions cannot be reversed. They chose to alter the blockchain. A majority of miners agreed to run software that created a new version of history in which the theft had never occurred. The decision split the Ethereum community. Some users continued running the old software, maintaining the original chain where the theft remained valid. The result was 2 separate cryptocurrencies, each claiming to be the legitimate version of Ethereum, each with its own ledger, its own community, its own exchange value. The question of which chain was correct had no technical answer. Both were functioning exactly as their respective software specified. The question was political. Which group's judgment about legitimate transactions should be considered authoritative? The standard response to these incidents is that they represent growing pains, edge cases that will become less common as the technology matures. This response misses what these incidents reveal about the relationship between information and value. When money exists as information, the question of what counts as authoritative information becomes the question of whose judgment to trust about which information systems to believe. This is not a technical problem that can be solved through better code or more robust protocols. It is a fundamental property of systems where value exists only as recorded data. The moment 2 information systems produce contradictory records, someone must decide which record to treat as legitimate. That decision cannot be made by the information itself. It requires human judgment about which sources to trust, which rules to enforce, which version of events to accept as real. Every digital currency system contains mechanisms for making these decisions. In centralized systems, the decision is made by the institution maintaining the ledger. In decentralized systems, it is made through consensus mechanisms that concentrate decision-making power in the hands of those who control the most computing resources or hold the largest stakes. The difference is not whether human judgment is involved, but whose judgment counts, and under what circumstances their decisions can override what the information appears to say. This creates a specific vulnerability that traditional currency systems do not have. When physical currency fails, it fails in observable ways. Bills become counterfeit, coins debase, governments print more than they can sustain. These failures are detectable because they involve changes to physical objects or measurable economic indicators. When digital currency fails, it fails in the gap between what the information says and what that information means. The ledger may be perfectly intact, every transaction mathematically valid, every block properly chained to its predecessor, and yet the question of what those transactions represent, what obligations they create, what value they store, remains unresolvable because there is no external reference point to determine whether the information corresponds to anything beyond itself. The currency exists only because people agree that the information in the ledger represents value. The moment that agreement fractures, the moment different groups begin treating different versions of the ledger as authoritative, the question of whether the currency exists at all becomes a matter of which community you are asking and which ledger they have chosen to believe. The practical effect of this vulnerability becomes visible during periods of institutional instability. Between 2013 and 2015, Cyprus, Greece, and Venezuela each experienced currency crises that disrupted their traditional banking systems. In each case, Bitcoin adoption increased among populations seeking to preserve wealth outside the failing national currency. The standard narrative describes this as digital currency succeeding where government-issued money failed, providing a stable store of value when institutional trust collapsed. But the actual pattern was more specific. Bitcoin adoption increased during the initial phase of crisis, when people were moving value out of the failing currency into any available alternative. Adoption then declined as the crisis extended, and people discovered that Bitcoin had the same vulnerability their national currency had. Its value depended on other people continuing to agree that it had value. When that agreement weakened, when exchanges closed or restricted withdrawals, when transaction volumes overwhelmed network capacity and fees became unpredictable, when the price volatility made it unclear whether holding Bitcoin preserved or destroyed wealth, people did not continue using it as a store of value. They converted it to dollars, euros, or physical goods. They discovered that in conditions of genuine institutional failure, the question of what survives is not which information system is most mathematically sound, but which value store other people will continue to recognize as valuable. This is the pattern that Bitcoin advocates consistently misinterpret. They treat increased adoption during crisis as evidence that digital currency can replace failing government money. But the adoption is temporary, driven by panic rather than genuine trust in the alternative system. Once the immediate crisis passes, or once people discover that the alternative system has its own vulnerabilities, adoption reverses. The currency that survives is not the one with the most robust technology or the most decentralized consensus mechanism. It is the one that the largest number of people will accept in exchange for goods, services, or other forms of wealth. In practice, this means that in nearly every crisis where Bitcoin adoption temporarily increased, the currency that people ultimately relied on was the US dollar. Not because the dollar was more stable in any absolute sense, not because US institutions were more trustworthy than the failing local institutions, but because more people in more places would accept dollars in exchange for things of value. The dollar's stability was not intrinsic to the currency itself. It was a function of network effects, historical momentum, and the ongoing belief that other people would continue accepting dollars even if local institutions failed. This reveals something fundamental about what gives money its value. The standard economic explanation is that money serves three functions: medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value. A currency succeeds when it performs these functions reliably. But this explanation treats the functions as properties of the currency itself, characteristics that emerge from its design or the institutions backing it. What the pattern of crisis adoption actually demonstrates is that these functions are not properties of the currency. They are properties of the social agreement to treat certain information or objects as valuable. That agreement is maintained not primarily through institutional enforcement or mathematical protocols, but through the expectation that other people will continue honoring the agreement, even when conditions change. The moment that expectation breaks, the moment people begin to suspect that others will stop accepting the currency, the functions cease to operate regardless of whether the currency itself has changed. This is why currency failures follow a characteristic pattern. The currency does not gradually lose value as its backing weakens or its supply increases. It maintains approximate stability until a threshold is crossed, then loses value catastrophically as the expectation of future acceptance collapses. The information or objects that represented money do not change. What changes is the collective belief that those representations will continue being recognized as valuable. The belief that mathematical protocols can stabilize this agreement ignores what happens to information during institutional collapse. On February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Russian ruble lost approximately 30% of its value in international markets within hours. The Russian government responded by restricting currency transfers, limiting withdrawals from banks, and requiring exporters to convert foreign currency earnings to rubles. These controls had a measurable effect on ruble exchange rates, but they had a more significant effect on information. It became unclear what the official exchange rate actually meant when most transactions could not occur at that rate. It became unclear what bank balances represented when withdrawals were limited. It became unclear what price quotes signified when the prices could not be locked in through completed transactions. The information systems that usually provided clarity about the ruble's value were all functioning. Exchange rates were being published. Bank balances were being updated, price quotes were being displayed, but none of this information could be used to answer the question that mattered. What could you actually do with rubles? The gap between what the information said and what it meant made the information worse than useless. It created the appearance of normal market function, while the actual mechanisms of price discovery had been disrupted. This is precisely the condition that Bitcoin was designed to resist. The protocol prevents any single party from restricting transfers, limiting withdrawals, or controlling exchange rates. Transactions either complete according to the mathematical rules, or they do not occur at all. There is no mechanism for human intervention to override the protocol's operation. In theory, this should make Bitcoin more resilient during institutional collapse, because it removes the possibility of administrative control. In practice, Bitcoin faced the same information problem that the ruble did, but with a different mechanism. As Russian citizens attempted to convert rubles to Bitcoin, transaction volume overwhelmed network capacity. Fees increased unpredictably. Transactions that appeared confirmed would sometimes be reorganized out of the blockchain when miners chose to build on different blocks. Exchange platforms were pressured by their own governments to restrict transactions involving Russian users. The protocol itself functioned exactly as designed, processing transactions according to its mathematical rules. But the ecosystem surrounding Bitcoin responded to institutional pressure in ways that created the same gap between information and meaning that Russian citizens were experiencing with the ruble. The blockchain showed transactions completing. Those transactions were, according to the protocol, final and irreversible. But whether those transactions meant that value had actually moved, whether the Bitcoin could actually be converted to other currencies, whether the exchanges showing those conversions would actually allow withdrawals. None of this could be determined from the information in the blockchain. The mathematical certainty of the protocol did not eliminate the uncertainty about what that certainty meant in practice. This pattern reveals the core misunderstanding that underpins most arguments about digital currency replacing government money. The argument assumes that currency fails because institutions become untrustworthy, and that replacing institutional trust with mathematical protocols solves the problem. But institutions do not fail because they become untrustworthy in some abstract sense. They fail because they stop being able to coordinate the collective belief that their currency will continue being accepted. When that coordination breaks down, the question is not whether the currency's information system is mathematically sound, but whether people believe other people will continue treating that information as meaningful. Mathematical protocols cannot answer that question. They can only enforce rules about how information changes. Those rules do nothing to guarantee that the information will continue representing value if the collective agreement to treat it as valuable dissolves. The clearest demonstration of this appeared in March 2003, when Silicon Valley Bank collapsed and the US government chose to guarantee all deposits, not just those under the statutory insurance limit. The decision was explicitly framed as preventing contagion, stopping depositors at other banks from withdrawing funds based on fear rather than actual insolvency. The economic argument for the decision was straightforward. Bank runs are self-fulfilling prophecies where the fear of collapse causes collapse regardless of the underlying financial health. But the decision revealed something more fundamental about what maintains currency stability. The guarantee worked not because it eliminated risk, but because it sustained the collective belief that deposits would remain accessible. The information in bank databases did not change. The actual financial position of most banks did not change. What changed was the expectation about whether other depositors would start withdrawing, and therefore whether it was rational to withdraw yourself. The government intervention stabilized that expectation, but the mechanism of stabilization was not economic in any direct sense. It was communicative. An authoritative actor made a public commitment that altered everyone's expectations about what everyone else would do. This is the function that Bitcoin cannot perform and was designed specifically to avoid. The protocol has no mechanism for central intervention to stabilize expectations during panic. This is treated as a feature, protecting the currency from arbitrary government manipulation. But what it actually means is that Bitcoin has no way to prevent self-fulfilling crises of confidence. When people begin to suspect that others will stop accepting Bitcoin, there is no institution with the authority to credibly commit that acceptance will continue. The protocol itself cannot make such a commitment because it has no mechanism for enforcing acceptance. It can only enforce the rules for recording transactions. Whether anyone will accept those transactions, whether exchanges will continue operating, whether merchants will honor payments. These questions are outside the protocol's scope. The mathematical certainty extends only to the blockchain's internal consistency. It says nothing about what that consistency means in a world where people have stopped believing the blockchain represents anything valuable. This limitation becomes acute during the specific conditions where advocates argue digital currency provides the most value. In failing states, in economies experiencing hyperinflation, in populations subject to capital controls, the argument is that Bitcoin offers an escape from institutional failure. But what these situations actually demonstrate is that when institutions fail completely, the currency that survives is not the one with the most robust information system. It is the one that can most reliably be exchanged for physical necessities. In Venezuela, during the peak of hyperinflation in 2018, Bitcoin adoption increased as people sought to preserve value outside the collapsing Bolivar. But the Bitcoin was not used primarily for purchases. It was used as an intermediate step to acquire dollars, which were then used to buy food and medicine. The pattern was not Bolivar to Bitcoin to goods. It was Bolivar to Bitcoin to dollars to goods. The digital currency functioned as a conversion mechanism, not as a store of value in its own right. When Venezuelans needed to actually purchase necessities, they used dollars or bartered directly, because those were the forms of value that vendors would accept with the least uncertainty about what they represented. The reason vendors preferred dollars over Bitcoin was not primarily about price volatility, though that was a factor. It was about settlement finality. When you accept physical dollars, the transaction is complete when the bills change hands. There is no mechanism for reversal, no possibility of reorganization, no uncertainty about whether the transaction will be honored by some future network state. When you accept Bitcoin, settlement finality depends on waiting for sufficient block confirmations to make reversal practically impossible. In a functioning economy with reliable internet and stable mining, this is a minor inconvenience. In a failing state, where power is intermittent and internet access is unreliable, the question of whether a Bitcoin transaction has actually settled becomes unanswerable for periods long enough to make accepting Bitcoin impractical for immediate transactions. The information system that was supposed to provide certainty through mathematical proof becomes a source of uncertainty when the infrastructure supporting that proof becomes unreliable. This is not a temporary technical limitation that will be solved through better infrastructure or protocol improvements. It is a fundamental property of systems where settlement finality depends on computational work performed by distributed participants. The security of the system comes from the fact that reversing transactions requires redoing the computational work faster than the network is adding new work. When the network's total computational power is high and stable, this makes reversal practically impossible. When the network fragments due to infrastructure failure, when mining becomes intermittent due to power outages, when different regions begin operating on different versions of the chain due to internet disruption, the assumption of irreversibility breaks down. You can have a mathematically valid transaction on one version of the blockchain that becomes invalid if a different version becomes the longest chain. The protocol cannot tell you which version will win, because that depends on which miners continue operating and which segments of the network can communicate with each other. These are not questions the protocol can answer. They are questions about physical infrastructure and social coordination that exist outside the information system. The Bitcoin community acknowledges this limitation, but treats it as affecting only extreme edge cases. The argument is that in any realistic scenario, the network has enough distributed computing power that localized infrastructure failure cannot cause chain fragmentation. This argument ignores the actual distribution of mining power. As of 2004, approximately 60% of Bitcoin mining occurs in 3 countries. When Kazakhstan experienced civil unrest in January 2022 that disrupted internet access and power supply, Bitcoin's hash rate dropped approximately 15% in a matter of hours. The network did not fragment because other regions compensated, but the incident demonstrated that Bitcoin's security assumptions depend on geographically concentrated infrastructure remaining operational. In a scenario where institutional failure is widespread enough to disrupt infrastructure in multiple regions simultaneously, the assumption that the network will remain coherent becomes questionable. This is precisely the scenario where advocates argue Bitcoin provides the most value, and it is exactly the scenario where Bitcoin's security model is most vulnerable. The response from protocol developers is that Bitcoin can operate over mesh networks, satellite connections, and other infrastructure that might survive institutional collapse. This is technically true, but misses the larger point. The question is not whether the protocol can continue processing transactions. The question is what those transactions mean when the social and economic context that gave them meaning has collapsed. You can have a perfectly functioning blockchain, every transaction mathematically valid, every block properly chained, and yet the question of whether those transactions represent anything valuable becomes unanswerable if there is no longer a functioning economy where Bitcoin can be exchanged for goods and services. The information is intact. What it represents has dissolved. This is the condition that physical currency can survive, but digital currency cannot. When institutions fail, when supply chains break, when normal economic activity ceases, physical currency retains value because it can be exchanged through direct negotiation without depending on any information system beyond the immediate transaction. You can verify that the bills are probably genuine through observable characteristics. You can complete the transaction without consulting any external authority or database. The settlement is final at the moment of exchange. Digital currency, by contrast, requires functioning infrastructure to verify transactions, to determine whether the information in the ledger is authoritative, to confirm that the transaction you think you completed was actually recorded and will be honored. When that infrastructure fails or fragments, the information system that was supposed to eliminate the need for institutional trust becomes worthless because there is no way to determine what the information means. This is why the question of what survives when money fails is not answered by examining which currency has the most robust technical design. It is answered by examining which forms of value can be exchanged with the least dependence on institutional coordination. Throughout history, when monetary systems collapse, the forms of value that continue to function are not those with the most sophisticated information systems. They are those that require the least information to verify and the least coordination to exchange. Gold, silver, cigarettes, alcohol, ammunition. These are not superior to digital currency because they are older or more primitive. They are superior because they can be evaluated and exchanged through direct observation and negotiation without requiring access to any database or consensus about which information to trust. Their value is not a function of the information recorded about them. It is a function of their physical properties and the immediate willingness of another party to accept them in trade. Digital currency advocates respond to this observation by pointing out that gold and physical goods have their own limitations, that they can be counterfeit or adulterated, that verifying their authenticity requires expertise and equipment. This is true, but it misses the distinction. Verifying a gold coin requires assessing its weight, size, and purity, all of which can be done through physical testing without accessing any external information system. Verifying a Bitcoin transaction requires accessing the blockchain, confirming that your version matches the canonical version, waiting for sufficient confirmations to ensure irreversibility, and trusting that the infrastructure performing these verifications will remain operational long enough for the transaction to settle. The difference is not about which verification is more reliable under normal conditions. It is about which verification remains possible when the information infrastructure fails. What this means is that the question, what survives when money fails, has a different answer depending on what type of failure you are contemplating. If money fails because institutions become corrupt or incompetent, but infrastructure remains intact, digital currency can provide an alternative because the information systems it depends on continue functioning. If money fails because institutions cease to exist or infrastructure collapses, digital currency fails with them because the information it contains cannot be verified or used. The only forms of value that survive complete institutional and infrastructure failure are those that can be exchanged without depending on any information system beyond the immediate transaction. This is not a design limitation that better protocols can overcome. It is a fundamental constraint on what information can do when the systems that give information meaning cease to operate. The broader implication is that the promise of digital currency to eliminate institutional trust through mathematical certainty fundamentally misunderstands what trust does in monetary systems. Trust is not primarily about believing that institutions will behave honestly or that protocols will execute correctly. Trust is about believing that other people will continue accepting the currency as valuable. That belief is maintained through institutional coordination, through legal tender laws, through network effects, through historical precedent, through 1,000 subtle mechanisms that make it rational to expect that the money you accept today will be accepted by others tomorrow. Mathematical protocols can eliminate the need to trust that transactions are being recorded honestly. They cannot eliminate the need to trust that those records will continue being treated as meaningful. When that second form of trust erodes, when people stop believing that others will honor the information in the blockchain, the mathematical certainty of the protocol becomes irrelevant. The information is perfect. What it represents has vanished.